it is time for more Velikovsky. It is time. All right, so right now we've got Venus is crossing paths with Earth. As it crosses paths with Earth, everything is going insane, right? The electromagnetic fields of both planets are interacting. Venus is in comet mode. It is shedding charge. Earth is shaking. You got tornadoes, earthquakes. You got mountains rising. You've got continents rising and sinking. Atlantis people, here you go. Here's your explanation. Is it really that simple? Yes, you need to figure out how you get rid of an entire continent. This is how you do it. There you go. Not only did Atlantis probably go down during this time, but other civilizations were absolutely wiped out. Because don't forget, there are tons of other ancient histories out there of other cultures who also talk about sunken continents, right? You've got Mu, Hyperborea, what's that one in the Lemuria? You've got all of those other stories about sunken continents. You need an explanation of how the hell do you sink an entire landmass. Here you go. Here we go. You have your power source, you have your explanation scientifically, and it lines up with what all of those people talk about. All right, so this next part of the Velikovsky book and this part of the Worlds in Collision book that we are reading, you like that? You like how I stumble all over all of that? All right, so back to Worlds in Collision. This next part of the chapter is called
The Comet of Typhon.
Of all the mysterious phenomena which accompanied the Exodus, this mysterious pillar seems the first to demand explanation. W. Phython Adams, The Call of Israel. One of the places of the heavenly combat between the elementary forces of nature, as narrated by Apollodorus and Strabo, was on the way from Egypt to Syria. According to Herodotus, the final act of the fight between Zeus and Typhon took place at Lake Serbon on the coastal route from Egypt to Palestine. On the way from Egypt to Palestine, the Israelites, after a night of terror and strong east wind, witnessed the upheaval of the day of the passage. These parallel circumstances lead to a conclusion that will sound somewhat strange. Typhon, Typhoeus, lies on the bottom of the sea where the spellbound Israelites saw the upheaval of nature. Darkness, hurricane, mountains of water, fire, and smoke, recorded in the Greek legend as the circumstances in which the battle of Zeus with the dragon Typhon was fought. In the same pit of the sea lie the pharaoh and his hosts. Up to now, I have identified Rahab Typhon as a comet. But if Typhon lies on the bottom of the sea, is he not the pharaoh? This would mean that in the legend of Typhon, two elements were welded together. The pharaoh, who perished in a catastrophe, and the outrageous rebel against Zeus, the lord of the sky. Now, this is what's interesting about history, and it happens a lot, and it's one of the problems that we face all the time in trying to understand ancient histories. We will find that many different motifs have indeed been welded together. And whether or not, why this is done, it could be done just because that's how maybe it was originally done, or the original context is gone. Obviously, the original context is gone, and that's actually one of the huge problems that we have to deal with, because when we hear these stories, they sound fantastical. What they are describing is literally insane. I mean, this level of destruction is luckily scientifically possible, but it's still crazy. And how are these people even going to transmit this kind of a story anyways during and after all of this stuff happens, right? I mean, it's like today, if something crazy like this happened today, an event like this would literally wipe out, the power plants would be gone, satellites would be gone. We would be thrown back quite literally to the Stone Age, because I have no doubt at all that there's probably some EMP situations going on here as well. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But I don't even think you need that to basically take our entire civilization and throw it back to not even the Stone Age, but I mean like the crawling on the ground, just hoping you survive minute to minute age. I mean, if you have continents rising and falling, if you have all of this level of destruction, even in our civilization today, your average person is going to lose the ability to transmit to transmit the history that you're experiencing now, right? I mean, you can't write it down on paper. That's not going to last hundreds or thousands of years. You can't put it on your cell phone or your computer. The batteries are going to die instantly. You have like an hour, you have like a day or so of battery, and then you're done. There's nothing else you can do there. And if all the power grids and everything are knocked out, how are you going to recharge, right? You quickly find yourself in a position to where you are no longer able to transmit the history of everything that you and everyone around you has experienced. So that's where oral history comes into play, and that's why it's so important to pay attention to oral history, because this oral history was literally one of the only tools tons of people had available to them, or the survivors, I should say, had available to them to carry on and at least transmit it to the following generations. Anyway, so we as researchers are going to be dealing with how our ancestors even made the attempt to carry on these stories. And a lot of the times we're going to see things welded together, like Velikovsky says, right? So we talk about a pharaoh, people who are into the Abrahamic religions. There's the pharaoh, the sea is split and a pharaoh goes in there and he dies. But Velikovsky is right here bringing up a very good point, because the pharaoh is also related to the comet Typhon, and they're talking about something that gets covered by the sea. He makes a great point. Was Pharaoh a real person in the sense that we think of pharaohs nowadays, or have we mistranslated or missed the point? And what it really was the comet Typhon all along. They were talking about a heavenly body that they, as far as they're concerned, the way it looks to them, the cometary body goes into the sea. Not literally. We're not saying that Venus crashed into the ocean. What they're saying is that Venus would have gone beyond the horizon, looking like it's going into the sea. Now, this also does not mean that the people who were witnessing this and trying to recount it literally meant like, oh yeah, the planet went into the sea. No, they were just trying to describe what it looked like from their point of view. So don't forget that. Don't forget that just because the way our ancestors described stuff, like this is a great example. They knew very well that that Venus had not gone into the Earth's ocean, but it just happens to look like that, and that's how they describe it. All right, let's get back. In Pliny's Natural History, the 91st section of the book reads, "A terrible comet was seen by the people of Ethiopia and Egypt, to which Typhon, the king of that period, gave his name. It had a fiery appearance, and was twisted like a coil, and it was very grim to behold. It was not really a star so much as what might be called a ball of fire." So right there, okay, so that makes the point. See, so you can name people after a comet, right? So like Halley's Comet, for example. Halley, the guy who created, who made the discovery of Halley's Comet. Dude, it's a man, his name is Halley. His last name is Halley. Then, of course, the comet is named Halley as well. So when Halley dies, are we talking about the man, or are we talking about the comet? Just something to think about, all right? Anyway, just for some context, this is important. The visit of a disastrous comet, so many times referred to in this book, is told in plain words, not in disguise. However, I must find support for my assumption that the comet of the days of King Typhon was the comet of the days of the Exodus. I investigated, that's Velikovsky, Velikovsky investigated the writings of the old chronographers, and in Cometographia of Hevelius 1668, I found reference to the works of Calvisius, Helvicus, Herlichius, and Rockenbach, all of whom used manuscripts for the most part and not printed resources, as they lived only a little over a century after the innovation of movable characters and the printing press. Something else actually to point out really quick, just in general history, but one of the things that we find is when we start to read older writings is that these people who were writing back, let's say here in the 1600s or whatever, they had access to resources that we no longer have access to, which is sucks that we lost what we lost, but never forget that so when you guys read some of this stuff and you're like, well, where did they get this information from? I don't see it anywhere. That's because it's gone. Like, it no longer exists. And that's what makes books like this extremely interesting and valuable, because the sources that these guys used to write their books, like back in the 1600s, they're gone. So this is all we have. And in fact, it's interesting, as another side note, you like how I keep trailing off? A lot of books by Romans and Greeks, all the philosophers, Plato and stuff, we don't have any original works by Plato, right? And there's entire works that are literally just references of references. Like, there's no original work. Okay, anyway, let's get moving on. You get the point. Hevelius wrote in Latin, in the year of the world 2453, they think that would be 1495 BC. According to certain authorities, a comet was seen in Syria, Babylonia, India, in the sign of Joe, in the form of a disk, at the same time when the Israelites were on their march from Egypt to the Promised Land. So Rockenbach, the exodus of the Israelites, is placed by Calvisius in the year of the world 2453, or 1495 BC. I was fortunate enough to locate one copy of Rockenbach's De Cometis Tractatus Novus Methodicus in the United States. This book was published by Wittenberg in 1602. Its author was professor of Greek mathematics and law and dean of philosophy at Frankfurt. He wrote his book using old sources which he did not name, and that sucks. Ex probicius ir antiquimius veturium scriptoribus, for the most trustworthy and the most ancient of early writers. As a result of his diligent gathering of ancient material, he made the following entry. In the year of the world 2453, as many trustworthy authors, on the basis of many conjectures, have determined, a comet appeared, which Pliny also mentioned in his second book. It was fiery, of irregular circular form, with a wrapped head. It was in the shape of a globe and was of terrible aspect. It is said that King Typhon ruled at that time in Egypt. Certain authorities assert that the comet was seen in Syria, Babylonia, India, in the sign of Capricorn, in the form of a disk. At the same time when the children of Israel advanced from Egypt toward the Promised Land, led on their way by the pillar of cloud during the day and by the pillar of fire at night. It's kind of amazing that even back then, like I said, whenever you read older texts of people trying to figure out stuff that happened in their past, they're already on the right track. And the good news is that they have access to information that we no longer have access to. Like, that stuff is gone now. So that's what makes this stuff invaluable. But what's even more important is these people are having the exact same problems that we're having right now. But they're at a disadvantage. Well, they're at a sort of disadvantage back in the day because they don't understand, or at least I don't think, I'm not going to speak for them, but the concept of a comet and what a comet is and how it works. I mean, they get the concept of a comet, but they don't know all the sciences behind it. I mean, hell, even right now in today's day and age, the mainstream refuses to acknowledge the real sciences behind comets. It's ridiculous. So, but anyway, but the people back then had, they had no idea how that stuff was working, right? They wouldn't have understood the interactions and the science and why the outcomes were what they were. Which also helps give them validity, because that means since they can't make this stuff up, they can't lie about it. I mean, you have to know the science to write this stuff. So that also helps us account for the validity of their works as well, which is incredibly invaluable. Which, okay, going on. Rockenbach did not draw any conclusions on the relation of the comet of the days of Exodus to the natural phenomena of that time. His intent was only to fix the date of the comet of Typhon. Among the early authors, Litus, Servius, who quotes Avienus, Hephaestion, and Junctinus, in addition to Pliny, mention the Typhon comet. It is depicted as an immense globe, globus immodicus, of fire, also as a sickle, which is a description of a globe illuminated by the sun, and close enough to be observed thus. That's a good point. See, this is what's awesome stuff. You can't see, like right now, if you go try to look at Venus, you're not gonna. Well, you couldn't see. I guess you wouldn't be able to see the dark side of Venus anyway. But there's no crescent, right? If you look up at the moon, right, the moon has to be there for you to see the crescent. It's got to be close. Otherwise, you're not seeing it. So if people back then are already describing this kind of stuff, it had to be there. These people had to have seen that body in the sky. Its movement was slow. Its path was close to the sun. Its color was bloody. It was not of fiery, but of bloody redness. It caused destruction in rising and setting. Servius writes that this comet caused many plagues, evils, and hunger. Now the plague thing relative to comets is fascinating. I don't know how much he gets into it here, but I gotta do another show on all that plague stuff. There is a weird connection, and I'm not clear on it, but anyway, we gotta talk about that. Alright. To discover what were the manuscript sources of Abraham Rockenbach that led him to the same conclusion at which we have arrived, namely that Typhon was a comet appeared in the time of Exodus, is a task not yet accomplished. Alright, so we never figured it out. Servius says that more information about the calamities caused by this comet is to be found in the writings of the Roman astrologer Campestor and in the works of the Egyptian astrologer Pedosiris. It is possible that copies of works of some authors containing citations from the writings of these ancient astrologers preserved in the libraries of Europe were Rockenbach's manuscript sources. How much stuff have we lost? Oh man, it sucks. Or how much stuff do we just not have access to nowadays? Like the real Dresden Codex or any of that stuff over there in the Vatican. Can you imagine what those guys have? Weird. Alright. Where am I at? Campestor, as quoted by Leitus, was certain that should the comet Typhon again meet the Earth, a 4-day encounter would suffice to destroy the world. So they were already calculating it back then, They were already looking at that possibility, that if you had something like that pass by us, that would be, okay. This implies also that the first encounter with the comet Typhon brought the Earth to the brink of destruction. But even without this somber prognostication of Campestor, we have a very imposing and quite inexhaustible array of references to Typhon and its destructive action against the world. Almost every Greek author referred to it. That's pretty interesting. The real nature of Typhon being that of a comet, as explained by Pliny and others, all references to the disaster caused by Typhon must be understood as descriptions of natural catastrophes in which the Earth and the comet were involved. As is known, Pallas of the Greeks was another name for Typhon. Also, Seth of the Egyptians was an equivalent to Typhon. Thus, the number of references to the comet Typhon can be enlarged by references to Pallas and Seth. So that's a really good point here. So don't forget, like we call Venus Venus. That's what we know Venus as. But every ancient culture back in the day, they had a different name for Venus. And that actually kind of goes to the point of these civilizations must not have been talking all that much back in the day. Well, I guess they could have been. That's a good problem. So before Comet Typhon or Venus smashes by Earth, well, yeah, the kind of civilizations you would have had. Like I mentioned Atlantis earlier in this talk. I'm not saying for sure that this is where Atlantis and Mu and Lemuria and Hyperborea go down, but this particular catastrophe, this is where it certainly seems like it would go down. Like this is how you get rid of continents. And we have eyewitness testimony to saying that this is when continents go away. I know there's a lot of people try to throw, for example, Atlantis into the deluge period. That's what took out Atlantis. Don't forget, the deluge is not described how Atlantis went down. The deluge is a ton of rain, right? Just rain. Like it's a ton of water from the sky. Completely different from mountains of water being, rolled across the planet. Just as a side note, just for you Atlantis researchers out there to remember. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. Or not here, later. So the takeaway here is to remember that as you study other cultures and ancient cultures, don't forget they are going to have different names for the planets. And they could be subtle names. So for example, I think one of the interesting things, and this is something I'm still digging into, but the American Indians, and I forget the tribe, it's kind of ubiquitous, but one of them has the story of you have a raven and an eagle, and the raven and the eagle, they build an island and they do this stuff, but if you transplant the name of Raven and Eagle with Mars and Venus, suddenly all of the actions of Raven and Eagle start to make sense in a scientific way. Anyway, okay, that's digressing. Let's finish this up. It was not only Abraham Rockenbach who synchronized the appearance of the comet Typhon with the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Looking for authors who might have done likewise, I found that Samuel Bochart, a scholarly writer of the 17th century, in his book Heroizikon, has a strange passage in which he maintains that the plagues of the days of the flight of Typhon is the exodus of Moses from Egypt. In this, he actually follows the passage transmitted by Plutarch. But since Typhon, according to Pliny and others, was a comet, Samuel Bochart was close to the conclusions at which we arrive, traveling along another route. So, one of the problems they have back then, of course, and we just kind of mentioned it already, is that they are not ready to jump to the planet side of things. And they, and it's funny, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, they, the concept of planets obviously existed. They knew what planets were, but they didn't have the depth of knowledge of what a planet truly, really was, what the various planets truly were, right? They didn't know that Saturn was a gas giant. Well, they knew that Saturn was a star. Okay, that follows through. All right, that's another subject too. But it's just something to think about. It's very interesting to see what conclusions older researchers back in the day were coming to as they're trying to, slog through all this and trying to figure out what we're trying to figure out, and to see their outcomes, to see what they figured out, because that stuff can help us, because that's a different perspective that we don't get nowadays. So that ends the introduction to Comet Typhon. As we continue through some of this book, I don't know how far I'm going to go with it. I'm just going to keep going and have fun. And we'll stop when we're not having fun anymore. But I'm having a blast. So there's going to be different names for Venus all throughout history. And Velikovsky is going to touch on all of that. So as we progress, keep in mind that ancient cultures are describing the same events, but they're going to use different terminology than what another culture is using. So don't forget that. And then also we have to deal with translation issues. And then of course the passage of time destroys stuff and blah, 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 all that stuff. All right, we'll get to the next reading next. That was part 10. We'll do 11. Okay, that's it.